Neighbor's Choice continues. I'm David Gornoski, your host. Hope you're doing well. Remember, go to our website at neighborschoice.com for all of our content on demand if you missed any of it. And I want to have our guest now join me. He is our go-to guest for understanding what's going on militarily in the conflict in Ukraine. He is an expert in this area, and he is someone who has worked in the Trump administration, in the Department of Defense, the Pentagon. Colonel Douglas Macgregor returns. How you doing, sir?
Great, David.
It's great to have you back. You know, we haven't talked to you in a few weeks, and of course, this is the week where we're looking at the anniversary of this invasion, and we just saw Putin deliver a speech and Biden delivered a speech. There's a dueling speech thing going on. What's your takeaway from what you've seen of these speeches and announcements?
I think it's important for Americans to understand that President Biden's trip to Poland and Ukraine was really about signaling to the NATO alliance that as long as he's president, obviously, we are going to continue to provide support for Ukraine. The NATO alliance behind the scenes is very divided, and the overwhelming majority of Europeans are making it clear to their governments that they do not wish to be dragged into a war with Russia. As a result, President Biden has gone over there to try and bolster European support for Mr. Zelensky and his government, and also to make it clear that we're not going to bail out anytime soon. The problem is that he also made a number of promises that were somewhat confusing and disappointing to the Ukrainians. He said he was going to give them $500 million. Obviously, you and I wouldn't be disappointed by that. But billions of dollars have already been spent. That's $500 million. And it's not going to buy the kind of capability that the Ukrainians think they want. It's also not going to provide equipment in time to make any difference to the battlefield. And I think that's the largest part, because the president said, well, we're going to get you 700 tanks and 1,000 artillery systems and so forth. There's no evidence that any of that's going to arrive in time to make any difference. And right now, frankly speaking, the Ukrainians are staring down the barrel of a very big gun. The Russians are now poised to launch what I would call decisive offensive operations to crush what remains of the Ukrainian army and seize certainly what is east of the Dnieper River. And that's one of the reasons that President Putin spoke. He was trying to once again revisit the rationale for why Russia has done what it's done, and to also make it clear to us in particular and the NATO alliance that if we are going to try and disrupt or intervene in the operations that the Russian armed forces are about to conduct, that they will end up in confrontation directly with Russia. And that includes any attempt to launch weapons from Polish territory, Lithuanian, Latvian, Estonian, Finnish, NATO territory in general, that will result in war with Russia, because the Russians will strike all those systems and assets on NATO soil if they are used against the Russians in support of the Ukrainians. So he put everybody on notice that this is serious, and we had better pay attention, because this is a no-nonsense message. If you want war with Russia, these are the things that you can do, and you don't want war with Russia, don't do them.
Yeah. You know, I look at some of the things from the speech that, Michael Tracy said in his speech today, listing grievances against the U.S. Putin once again brings up the U.S. unilaterally terminating the INF treaty, which was done by Trump, who was supposedly colluding with Putin, even though a large number of Putin's grievances now relate to the actions of Trump. I mean, this is something that it wasn't just Biden, it wasn't just Obama. There was some blame with what was going on with the Trump administration as well, that in the part of leading up to this conflict becoming a hot war.
Well, we know that President Trump made a number of ill-considered choices when it came to appointees in his administration, only to discover that the majority of the people that he thought were supportive of his agenda were absolutely opposed to his agenda. Mr. Pompeo over at the State Department was a good example of someone who did everything he could to promote conflict with both Russia and China. and North Korea. And these were things that President Trump wanted to address. He wanted to make a change in course. He wasn't successful, not only because of Pompeo, but he ran into the same problems over at the Department of Defense with Mattis and Esper. When he finally discovered these things, it was too late to rectify the situation, unfortunately. But I think we do have to understand that the problems we confront today with Russia began in the 90s. And they began under the Clinton administration with the decision to push the borders of NATO well beyond the limits that were agreed to by Gorbachev and President George Bush. And as a result, the Russians had told us repeatedly, do not push NATO to our national borders. If you do that, we will not accept it. And ultimately, we not only pushed it to their borders, but we decided to make Ukraine a launching pad for attack against Russia. We built up its army over the last 8 years with the goal of eventually attacking Russia and retaking control of the Crimea and destroying the Russian breakaway provinces in eastern Ukraine. And Putin repeatedly asked for equal rights for the Russians that were living in Ukraine, that constitute almost a third of the population. That was the basis for the so-called Minsk agreements. Those things were ignored. He indulged the 2014 Maidan coup that put a government into Kiev that was unambiguously hostile to Moscow and reported to us and essentially acted as our puppet. So he went back over these things to say, look, we're not going to tolerate this any longer. We're now in a position to change this condition. And remember, the things that he wanted most of all for Ukraine involved neutrality. He simply did not want Ukraine to become a part of NATO and therefore a direct threat to Russia. And we've made it very clear over the last 20 years that we're threatening Russia. We're not satisfied with any sort of deal that doesn't remove Mr. Putin from power, that doesn't, quote-unquote, punish Russia, doesn't destroy its economy, ultimately dismember it, and make it effectively ineffective as a nation state. These things are unacceptable. The Russians aren't going to put up with it, and so they're going to fix the problem the only way that they know how to fix it at this point, which is to go into Ukraine, root out the problem, and establish a new territorial status quo.
When you look at the speech from Putin today, he highlighted again the culture war dynamic that he sees as what's going on with this conflict, not just the aspect of NATO. He says, see what they do with their own peoples, the destruction of the family, cultural and national identity, perversion, mockery of children, and pedophilia are declared the norm. I mean, he doesn't mention that abortion is very high in his country and divorce is very high in his country as well. But it's clear that there is some clear differences and priorities about culture and children and gender between the Russian government and the Western governments. You mentioned earlier.
I would tell you that Russia is an Orthodox Christian country. This is not a country that pretends to be secular. It doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. Historically, it's an Orthodox Christian nation with an Orthodox Christian culture, and they are recovering from 70-plus years of communism. And that's not an easy thing to do, David. And the problems that you pointed to, this on-demand abortion disaster, and the problems with human relations between men and women and divorce and so forth, those things were exacerbated to the point of almost societal destruction under communism. He has done everything he could to try and rectify that and roll that back. But he is also right when he points to the attitudes in the West towards gender. I mean, we have a government that believes that men can have babies. We are appointing justices to the Supreme Court that are incapable of identifying a woman. We have people that are simply rejecting science and biology in favor of some sort of neo-Marxist ideology that wants to treat human beings as fungible material, things without souls. That's what he was talking about.
Do you think that that's what motivates a lot of the folks in the decision making at the State Department in D.C. as they want to impose their gender identity politics and
oh, yes,
mockery?
I do. Yeah, I do. I think so. I think that's our biggest problem right now is that the kinds of destructive policies that are aimed at Americans are being exported. We're not satisfied with whatever has been accomplished here in terms of same-sex marriage and mutilating people's genitals to change them into something they were not initially born as. And we want to export that. We want to fly the LGBTQ flags from our embassies. That's the international movement and goal of the administration. This sort of thing is anathema to most of the world, David. Yeah. There are very few countries in the world that support this and want this. So you can imagine that we are making enemies every day that passes by the millions and hundreds of millions.
Do you believe it's an intentional goal by American foreign policy to destroy ancient and Orthodox Christian communities in the Middle East and abroad? Serbia, Ukraine, now bans the Orthodox Church. Syria, a lot of churches were destroyed by the activities of American allies over there against Assad. Iraq, displacing ancient Christian communities. It seems like it's becoming kind of a policy here now when you look at every country we've been involved in the last few decades that those types of ancient Christian communities suffer.
Well, if it's not a deliberate policy, as you point out, it certainly looks like it. So I haven't heard anybody say that publicly, but I think it's pretty clear that this administration feels a great deal of contempt for religion in general, but specifically Christianity. And, of course, that creates enormous problems for us here in the United States because whether or not you're a regular churchgoer, Christianity is bound up with our culture, our history, our national identity. And the same thing is true in most of the world, wherever there are religious majorities, and they see their countries as inherently bound up with their religion. If you go to places like Iraq or Saudi Arabia or, Morocco, Egypt, it's unambiguous. Islam, Islamic culture are bound up with the nation, its history, its people. We have the same thing in Europe with Christianity. So, yeah, it may not be the announced policy, but I think the hostility is real.
Very good to have you back, Colonel Douglas Macgregor. I want to let you go. I know you're very busy with a lot of different things going on, so thank you for joining our program as always, and we'll continue to follow your thoughts and hear more from you. And your website, douglasmacgregor.com, has all of your books and media appearances for folks who want to see more.
Well, David, make sure you tell all of your listeners that they need to make it abundantly clear to their representatives on the Hill, as well as to the White House, that they do not want to go to war with Russia, because we are arguably on a path to direct confrontation with Russia. It's a very dangerous path. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for what you do. It's a godsend to have folks like you saying what you're saying and doing it every day to make sure people understand the stakes that are at play.